Resource revenues are notoriously challenging to manage. Sovereign wealth funds can help, but are they the silver bullet they're sometimes portrayed to be? Joining me here is Victoria Barbary of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. Let's start with a basic question. What are sovereign wealth funds?
Sovereign wealth funds are special purpose funds or arrangements owned by general government to achieve financial objectives. In reality, what that means is they can have a range of objectives from traditional savings funds, stabilisation funds, and funds that invest at home for some form of macroeconomic strategic objective as well, or they can be a hybrid of those and have more than one objective.
Are all these sovereign wealth funds set up for the sustainable development of the country?
I think that when a lot of these funds were set up in, the older funds specifically, sustainable development in 1953, or even for Kuwait, or even in 1984, when its current legal structure was put into force, sustainable development wasn't a thing. It wasn't a concept that we thought about, and I think sovereign wealth funds are naturally conservative institutions, and it has taken them a while to kind of realise that this isn't just a flash in the pan, that sustainability can drive long-term returns, and I think there's an increasing amount of literature that supports that.
What is the link to extractives here?
About half our members are funds that come from oil money, so from oil resource revenues, and that is mostly funds from the Middle East, as you might expect, where they've been saving money since Kuwait Investment Authority was set up in 1953.
And some are minerals-based, other minerals than oil?
So we have one member from Botswana, the Pula Fund that's managed by the Bank of Botswana, that comes from diamond mining. So that's a unique fund.
In terms of sovereign wealth funds, what role do the Santiago principles play?
So the Santiago principles are a voluntary set of 24 generally accepted principles and practices for sovereign wealth fund management. They were written by 26 sovereign wealth funds back in 2008, and they cover good governance structures, investment and risk management practices that are best practice for large long-term government-owned investors.
Are there any sanctions attached to non-compliance?
It's not a rules-based system. It's very much a principles-based system, as the generally accepted principles and practices might suggest. So we don't expect every member to be completely, perfect with the Santiago principles from day one. What we do want to see is progress, and for some of the younger funds that will be relatively marked over a 3-year period. For the older members from the Gulf or from Singapore, that will be less pronounced. But obviously, we do expect to see some form of progress, and where we are concerned, we do write to our members that if there are concerns and requests more information or assurances that these are still being applied.
The challenge of managing resource revenues is well documented, and one issue relates to price volatility. How effective are sovereign wealth funds in stabilizing government expenditure?
So not all sovereign wealth funds are designed to stabilize government expenditure. You have a range of savings funds that are the kind of more well-known funds that have an asset allocation and investment policy that is designed to generate long-term returns over many years. For those funds that are designed for stabilization, I don't think there's kind of any widely, you can't say yes or no. Anecdotally, stabilization funds have been successful. It's always good to have that pot of money. I mean, if you think about the Chilean government's use of their stabilization fund following the financial crisis, they withdrew $9 billion for countercyclical spending, which, if you look at the recovery of Chile's economy, was more rapid than other countries in the region. So I think there are examples where you can say that they have been helpful. On the whole, I don't think you can generalize.
A question that comes to my mind is if these funds are not just a convoluted way of what should be prudent fiscal policy.
Sovereign wealth funds are not a panacea. They're not the silver bullet that's going to make sure that you have, that is fiscal good, macroeconomic good practice. Not every economy will need one. And certainly in some circumstances that, you don't. There is a budgetary policy. But I think if we go back to just thinking about the kind of history of sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf in the 1950s to the 1970s, you're looking at Kuwait and Abu Dhabi, which were the first two sovereign funds. And those were instances where you had 200,000 people in a country and a huge, billions and billions of dollars of oil revenue coming in. There was no way that money could have been spent at home. If you now look at new countries with resource revenues, they tend to be in Africa or other kind of populous countries with large economies with huge spending needs in terms of things like infrastructure, healthcare, education spending. And therefore, you're not going to be in a situation where you're looking at Dutch disease, high inflation, inflationary pressures building up, overvaluation of the currency. So I think that you are now seeing that a lot of countries setting up sovereign wealth funds from oil money to invest directly at home rather than to save abroad, because that's not necessary for them. Their long-term investment is in their country and their people. But if you're looking at home, the governance has to be very good, has to be very solid. And I think that there have been, some criticisms of sovereign wealth funds of being this is just another layer of bureaucracy over, the budgetary process, and therefore you're trying to add a layer where you can have nepotism and corruption, and especially in those economies where those are a problem. Or and there have been incidences of accusations that this is just a way of trying to protect state assets from government creditors. And I think that those can be, if the governance isn't right, those could be potentially, valid criticisms.
So what is the chicken and what is the egg here? Do countries succeed because of good sovereign wealth funds, or do sovereign wealth funds succeed because of good governance?
I would say that governance is key. Everything is about good governance. A bad sovereign wealth fund will not help your macroeconomic framework. You have a framework for doing that for sovereign wealth funds now. And I think that that's how sovereign wealth funds succeed, is through having strict governance, separation between owner and management. And that's really the most important part of
so funds. Do you have an example of a fund, a well-managed fund that people may not have heard of?
So I think it would surprise people that the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority is as well managed as it is, given Nigeria's history of, through the excess crude account, of less than optimal resource money management. The NSIA was set up in 2012. It has 3 ring-fenced separate accounts, one for saving, one for stabilisation, and one for domestic infrastructure spending. And those have been, managed well within their means and have actually been very well managed over the past 6 years. And I think that it would surprise people to hear that Uche team has done such a great job in managing that money.
We talked about the importance of saving for a rainy day. A different issue is how to then invest these savings. Yeah. How efficient have sovereign wealth funds been as investors?
You can only really judge success of sovereign wealth funds by what their objectives are set out to be. And this, again, depending on what the government has required, it varies. So some funds have a situation where they're required to return every year inflation plus 5%. Others have a rolling target over 10, 15, 20 years. Others, don't necessarily have an absolute target at all. It's to generate the best risk-adjusted returns. If you look at risk appetite, that is what is going to really move what the percentage return is annually or over 5 or 10 years. So in Norway's case, Parliament has been very risk-averse over what they are willing to allow Pension Fund Global to invest in. They are not generating the returns that perhaps Australia, New Zealand, or Singapore is generating, because they have a much broader remit of assets that they can invest in that tend to be more illiquid, higher risk, higher return. So it's really that risk appetite that depicts what the absolute return of the fund is. But that doesn't mean that Norway is a worse investor than Australia. They can just invest in different asset mixes.
Something you touched upon is whether they should invest domestically or abroad. So what is best practice there?
That depends. You have a range of opinions on this. You have people who are very, very staunch that say, unless you have a structural surplus, you should not be saving money. And I think that is one of those approaches that is it's relatively well perspective. If you ask someone like Eric Parado, who was very influential in setting up the Chilean funds, he would be very militant on that point, that really that unless you have a surplus, you should be investing domestically or paying down your debt. If you do have that surplus, there is the Dutch disease issue, which is if you have a very small economy where you've got a large amount of oil money, you end up with your currency becoming overvalued, and it crowding the oil industry, crowding out other industries, et cetera, et cetera. That would be a situation where getting the money offshore is a good idea. What we are seeing now is that if you look at some, these resource-rich countries in Africa, that actually they have such large spending needs that those issues aren't really there. You can spend a lot of oil money appropriately at home, develop your economy, and you're not going to get inflationary pressures or overinflated currency. So I think that it depends on the macroeconomic framework. But if you're investing in your future, which is maybe the most appropriate use of some of this resource money, and creating something that's a renewable resource from a non-renewable one, then investing in your country and your economy and your people is potentially more powerful than saving at home.
Victoria, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
And to keep up with the debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.